The 20th century started, as they say, on the wrong foot. Europe split into gym bosses called the Entente and into unloved outsiders called the Triple Alliance. In just a few years, this would turn into the scariest and most bloody war in history at that moment. Small Europe, which was literally the center of the world back then and controlled more than half the Earth as colonies, lost tens of millions of lives and became ruins. Some cities stayed as ghosts forever, and in France there is still an exclusion zone filled with toxins and covered with unexploded shells. The losing empires collapsed and had to pay insane reparations. And the winners were not really celebrating either. Russia broke apart, France was rebuilding, and England was trying to drag the debtors alone while also paying its own debts. Since that time, Europe never got back its status as the center of the world, and an ordinary worker could feel like the end of the world had arrived. But an ordinary worker from the United States would disagree. Right now, this is going to be one of the most exciting journeys of your life. You're watching Secret Chapters. Smash like, and here we go. If we step a little into the backstory, the United States is a true dark horse. Just some distant, unprofitable former colony that got independence a bit more than 100 years earlier, and where slavery was abolished only in 1860, when even serfdom in Europe was already seen as archaic and inhumane. But the main reason the US was a dark horse was the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said the old world stays out of the new world, and the new world stays out of the old. For the whole 19th century, the US lived almost completely detached from Europe, except for a few cases like territory sales and contracts with private businesses. But by the end of the century, the US would boost its economy thanks to industry growth, business expansion, and the gold rush, and that made it feel far more confident. You could see it at least in the fact that it started breaking its own Monroe Doctrine, a war with Spain, вмешательство in Japan and China, and even a try at colonizing Africa through Liberia. But the biggest move was joining World War I. Joining the war, though, happened on U.S. terms. At first, the U.S. simply supplied the Entente with ammo, food, equipment, and everything else. And it did that, of course, not out of kindness, but on credit. That's where Europe's debts came from. This generosity multiplied American exports several times over, and an economy that already felt fine before the war basically launched into the stratosphere. In 1917, the U.S. finally entered the war officially and even sent troops to France. But unlike Europeans, the average American never truly felt the war. And that boom is what created the Roaring '20s in the U.S. Honestly, perfect branding. Constant jazz, endless dancing, roads full of cars that were literally a luxury item yesterday, movies becoming weekly entertainment for the masses rather than a one-time treat for the elite. And alongside that, a sexual revolution, suffragettes winning ground, and the slow expansion of rights for Black Americans. Those are the symbols of the era. Even with Prohibition, people felt freer and more stable than ever before. President Hoover claimed humanity was half a step away from defeating global poverty and hunger. Economic growth and production growth led to wage growth. And wage growth let people not just start families calmly and hide bills under the pillow for a rainy day. People began thinking about where to put their extra money. The stock market was the answer, where anyone could buy and trade company shares. And if rancher only the elites could afford these risky games, now the crowd flooded in. A big part of it was the rich neighbor effect. If you see your neighbor Bob buy shares, say in Coca-Cola, and start earning decent dividends, you'll most likely want to copy that success too. There were Bobs like that and their neighbors all over America. Shares were being bought hard, companies' market caps were growing by tens of times, and dividends grew with them. We're not economists, and our channel isn't about that, so we won't dive into the theory of how the stock exchange works. The main thing for us, historically, is to catch the point. Money started getting made literally out of thin air, and a company's price stopped matching its real earnings. The numbers became truly unreal. A bubble swelled up. At some point, someone had to notice it and take profit before the bubble burst. That point arrived on Thursday, October 24, 1929. Nobody knows what exactly triggered it, and the fall didn't happen in one single day, but the fact is the fact. People started selling shares. The ones who did it first stayed in the green. The ones who woke up late were dumping $100 shares for almost nothing. The warnings and reasons were there, obviously. The government warned people again and again about bubble risk, and each time it caused a dip, but it bounced back fast. A fresh crowd ran in, buying the briefly cheaper shares. On the official Dow Jones Index chart for the 1920s, 1930s, you can see those jumps, and you can also see the crash wasn't one moment, and the market kept sliding until 1933. But that's only half of it. Back then, banks were also trading heavily, which means they got hit too. And unlike normal companies, banks were holding the money of regular workers. Panic hit here as well. A rumor spread that some bank had burned all its money in stocks. People rushed that bank to take back their hard-earned cash. The bank had to hand out everything it had, and it went bankrupt. And yes, by then, a big part of the money supply was basically virtual already. Physically, this money didn't exist in the real world. It existed only on paper, in account records. So not every depositor managed to get their money, and there was no deposit insurance if a bank went under. Capital, deposits, and shares turned into a pumpkin. People began saving hard and went back to hiding money under the pillow. Demand fell sharply, and after it fell, the incomes of businesses and farmers. Companies had nothing to pay workers with, and then came the mass wave of layoffs. Unemployment jumped from 3% in 1929 to 25% in 33. Fired people cut spending, pushing demand even lower, and it kept looping. This is called a deflationary spiral. It's extremely hard to escape, and every central bank in the world still fears it like fire. Thanks, Great Depression, politicians and economists learned the lesson and figured out how to fight it. But before we talk about how the US fought the Depression, let's talk about everyday life for ordinary people in the depressed 30s. And surprisingly, it wasn't as bad as people think. You may have seen the so-called Hoovervilles, neighborhoods and even whole villages of poor people who couldn't afford normal housing. You may have seen photos of horses pulling cars with no fuel. You saw photos of pickets demanding jobs. For today, that's pure surreal. And you, of course, saw our videos about Great Depression cooking. No? Then go watch right after this video. There's a lot of wild stuff there. Baked onions stuffed with peanut butter and desperation pies. And, shit on roof tiles. And with that kind of menu, we still said it wasn't that bad. Yes, exactly. Of course, you wouldn't envy an entire generation's fate. Even in Russia in the 90s, people didn't have to build shacks on Red Square. But it's important not to fall into extremes. Sometimes you see claims about massive death rates during the Great Depression and almost full anarchy. But that wasn't the case. Unemployment and hunger did exist, but the state stayed solid on its feet. There was no collapse and no humanitarian catastrophe. Population growth slowed down, true, and that's obvious. When there's no money and none expected, not everyone chooses to have kids. No census shows a famine in the US. Sure, hunger deaths probably happened, but sadly they happen even now in fairly normal times. The state tried hard to help the needy. Public soup kitchens were organized, construction projects and businesses were funded just to create more jobs and push the economy chutnyem noga. President Hoover, who had the bad luck to be elected less than a year before the crash, and whose name ended up on those Hoovervilles, was a supporter of Adam Smith's classical economic theory. If some random business goes bankrupt, it means one thing: it was inefficient. And the capitalist system, like a living organism, won't leave a vacuum sitting there. Something new will appear in its place, and it will cover the needs of the economy and the people. In short, the market will handle it. And yeah, that's true. But there's always a but. But today, classical theory, even as the base of the world economy, has a million layers on top. And it was during the Great Depression that people understood this extra clearly. The market might handle the depression, sure, but it's not obvious when, how, or at what cost. John Keynes offered a new macroeconomic idea. The state should step into the market, regulate interest rates, regulate banks, the stock exchange, and even the amount of money moving around. Today, it's also outdated in a lot of ways, but back then, it was right on time. Hoover ignored Keynes and stuck to half measures, hoping the market would fix itself, and he predictably lost the 1933 election to Roosevelt, who from day one started acting in line with Keynes's logic. Roosevelt didn't solve the crisis instantly either, and a lot of what he did still gets criticized today. But fact, right after Roosevelt came in and his reforms started, the economy slowly but surely began to climb. Breaking down every single move would take a couple more videos, so here's the short version. First, banks got a few days of breathing room. That allowed audits and a real look at the situation, what we were even dealing with. Second, coins started being exchanged for paper dollars, which made it easier to print money and push it into the economy. That's one of the most effective ways to fight deflation in the short term. And it was also the first step toward ending the gold standard 40 years later. Third, a bunch of safeguards were introduced for the stock market and for banks. Strict control started over speculators who were inflating demand for useless shares. A deposit insurance system appeared, something no modern bank can operate without. And banks themselves were banned from trading on the market all the way into our century. Funny enough, a few years after that ban was removed, the 2008 crisis happened. A few more rounds of stepping on the same rake over later decades helped politicians and economists worldwide learn what they needed to learn. Because of those crises, we now have a fairly stable global economic ecosystem, and depressions like that don't threaten it anymore. The scariest part of the Great Depression isn't what Americans went through for a few years, but what people in other countries were about to go through. The ones hit hardest by the US Depression weren't the states themselves, but the countries that borrowed from them. Latin American countries that still haven't fully recovered, and of course, Europe, and especially Germany. Now you know more. Drop ideas for the next episodes in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. New video coming soon. Good luck!